There is a clay tablet in the University of Pennsylvania Museum that contains a sentence most people will never read. Catalog number CBS 1673, roughly 4,000 years old, recovered from the ruins of Nippur in what is now Iraq, preserved now behind climate-controlled glass, under museum light, under a silence so complete it almost feels ceremonial. The cuneiform inscription is clean and deliberate, the work of a scribe who understood that what was being pressed into the clay mattered, and mattered enough to survive him. The tablet is not large, smaller than a modern paperback, cool when handled with gloves, dense in a way first-time observers do not expect. Its edges have been worn smooth by centuries that did not erase it, only softened it. Under angled light, the wedge-shaped marks hold shadow, and those shadows make the script seem almost lifted from the surface, almost ready to rise. It does not feel like an object that merely contains a story. It feels like an object that contains a record. And that distinction, small at first, becomes difficult to ignore once it begins to settle in. Because the text describes the creation of human beings, but it does not describe that creation in the language people usually expect from ancient myth. Not in the language of sweeping poetry, not in the language of cosmic singing or effortless divine command. It reads instead like process. It reads like sequence. It reads like materials being gathered, roles being assigned, steps being followed. Human beings are not simply spoken into existence. They are fashioned from a mixture, not only formed, but mixed. The Sumerian vocabulary matters here because the vocabulary is strangely specific. The word for clay, for earth, for raw material appears. So does the word for blood, for essence, for the life substance of another being. One participant is instructed to prepare the clay. Another provides the design, the model, the template. A being is killed. Something from that being is taken. What is taken is combined with terrestrial matter. The order is preserved. The participants are preserved. The materials are preserved. And when a text preserves this much procedure, this much sequence, this much repeated specificity, it begins to sound less like ornament and more like instruction. That is what makes CBS 1673 so unsettling. Not because it is ancient. Ancient things can be comfortable once we have placed them safely inside a familiar category, but because this tablet resists comfort. It resists easy placement. If it were simply vague, simply beautiful, simply symbolic, it would sit more peacefully inside the word mythology. Yet the language remains stubbornly procedural. A recipe, a process, a method described with the only vocabulary available to people who had never seen what we would call a laboratory, but may have been trying to preserve memory of something very much like one. And if that feels too strange, too sharp, too literal to be acceptable, that reaction matters. That discomfort matters, because this is where the question begins, not with certainty, not with proclamation, with a question. What kind of document is this? A myth preserved in technical language, or a technical memory preserved inside myth? Before going further, one small pause, and only one. If you are listening in the dark somewhere in a quiet room, or while the city outside has gone dim, leave a comment with where you are listening from. Your city, the hour. Whether you are listening while sleep approaches, or listening because sleep will not come. Questions travel strangely at night. They travel farther. And somewhere in other rooms in other cities, other people are following this same trail of words and asking themselves the same thing. What exactly did these scribes think they were preserving? The mainstream answer is simple enough. These are creation myths. Ancient people, like all ancient people, needed stories about where they came from. They projected familiar acts onto the heavens. Potters shaped clay, so gods shaped clay. Farmers mixed earth and water, so gods mixed substance and life. The stories were never meant as factual record. They were symbolic expressions of belonging, of purpose, of social order. And this interpretation is not foolish. It is coherent. It is defensible. It fits alongside Genesis Egyptian cosmology, Hindu creation traditions, and countless other origin accounts in which humanity emerges from earth and divinity together. And yet there is a problem with that reading. Not a loud problem, not an obvious one, a quieter problem. The problem of consistency, the problem of procedural repetition. Across tablets copied centuries apart from different cities by scribes who lived and died in worlds separated by long stretches of time, the core procedure stays the same. The same materials, the same stages, the same roles, the same result. Humanity is described as Lulu, the mixed one, the primitive worker, the being made deliberately for labor. Not simply man in the broad poetic sense, but something designated, something produced. That designation matters because myths often vary in the way living stories vary. They shift, they embellish, they absorb local color. They become larger, softer, more symbolic over time. But these texts do not drift very much where it matters most. Their theology may shift around the edges, names may move, emphasis may change, yet the mechanism remains stable. Blood or essence, clay or earth, mixing, gestation, birth, worker. Again and again the same sequence returns. And that is where another reading enters. Unwelcome in official rooms, dismissed quickly in academic language, spoken more carefully elsewhere. This other reading suggests the tablets may not be inventions at all, but records. That clay may indicate base biological material. That blood or essence may refer to inherited information, a template, a pattern carried in living substance. That mixing means exactly what it appears to mean: combination, hybridization, modification. This reading goes further, and because it goes further, it becomes harder to tolerate. It suggests that what the texts call those who came from heaven did not originate here. That they encountered terrestrial life, found it insufficient for the tasks they needed performed, and altered it, improved it, combined their own essence with what they found in the earth, made something new from something already here. A hybrid, a worker, Lulu. The tablet itself does not argue. It does not insist. It does not explain itself to us. It simply remains where it is in Philadelphia, under controlled light and controlled air, as patient as the centuries that carried it there. And the question remains with it, as quiet and as persistent as the clay itself. Are we looking at metaphor, or are we looking at memory, at symbol or specification, at myth or manual? The night, once that question is asked, becomes a little longer than it was before. And the next step in that long night takes us back to Nippur itself, to the earth that hid these tablets for millennia, and to the excavation that pulled them out into modern light. Beneath the dust of Nippur, the modern world touched a city that was already ancient when Babylon was still young. The year was 1889. Southern Mesopotamia stretched outward in heat and pale light, a landscape of flat horizons and wind-cut mounds that looked from a distance less like cities than like the weather itself had risen and settled into shape. But these mounds, these tells, were not natural. They were layered human time. City built on city, ruin over ruin, memory compacted into earth. Nippur mattered more than its silence suggested. It was never the great imperial capital in the way later cities would be. It did not dominate through armies or royal spectacle. Its authority was older than that. More sacred, Nippur was the religious heart of Sumerian civilization, the place where divine order was imagined to be anchored, where Enlil's temple stood as a kind of axis between heaven and earth. If a city could be called spiritual infrastructure, Nippur was that. And when the University of Pennsylvania expedition arrived there with tools, cameras, survey gear, and crates enough to carry away what they hoped to find, they were not expecting to disturb the foundations of the human timeline. Yet that is what happened. John Punnett Peters led the early stages of the excavation. Hermann Hilprecht would later become central to the work of interpretation. They dug through nearly 40 feet of accumulated debris, each layer marking a different era of occupation. What emerged was not evidence of civilization slowly stumbling into coherence. It was something more difficult, something more abrupt, sophisticated architecture, administrative systems, mathematics, law, astronomy, medical writings, literature, temple libraries, scribal archives, and everywhere tablets, not dozens, not hundreds, tens of thousands. Ultimately, more than 50,000 clay documents came out of the site, receipts and hymns, ration records and epics, administrative fragments and creation accounts, practical lists beside cosmic narratives. The sheer volume changed the problem. It was no longer possible to imagine a few isolated relics from a dim and experimental age. This was a civilization already writing, already recording, already preserving, already thinking in categories complex enough to govern cities, track labor, manage institutions, and reflect on origins. And the most difficult aspect of it all was not simply the quantity of writing. It was the maturity of the writing. Cuneiform, in its earliest forms, does not look like a clumsy first attempt. It does not appear as a weak bridge between picture and abstraction that only later becomes truly useful. It appears already working, already efficient for what it needs to do, capable of expressing legal reasoning, economic measurement, poetic lament, ritual sequence, and technical description. It enters the record not as a child's speech, but as a functioning instrument. This is where conventional historical models begin to feel strained. Civilization is supposed to rise gradually. Agriculture, then villages, then towns, then urban complexity, then writing as administrative necessity. That progression is clean, it is teachable, it fits how modern minds like to picture development. But Sumer complicates that picture, because at the deepest levels of its cities, sophistication does not arrive as a late flourish. It is already there. Planned architecture, large temples, specialized labor, literate administration, complex society at or near the beginning, as if civilization did not slowly grow into itself, as if it was laid down all at once. The Sumerians themselves had an explanation for that, and their explanation was neither shy nor obscure. They said their civilization was not invented. It was given. Kingship descended from heaven. The arts of ordered life were not discovered by trial and error alone, but transmitted. Writing law, architecture, metallurgy, mathematics, ritual, order, governance. These were me decrees, power-structured gifts passed from divine beings to humans. In Sumerian memory, civilization was inherited, restored, received, not pioneered. The mainstream interpretation, again, has a ready answer. Ancient peoples often attribute their social achievements to gods. That is not surprising. Divine sanction makes institutions feel older, larger, more legitimate. A people wishing to explain its own brilliance may place that brilliance in the hands of heaven first, then receive it back with authority attached. This is a familiar pattern. But the pattern becomes less comfortable when placed beside what the Sumerians actually claimed to know. Their mathematical system appears complete enough that we still live inside portions of it now. Base 60 survives every time a minute becomes 60 seconds, every time an hour becomes 60 minutes, every time a circle becomes 360 degrees. Their astronomical traditions describe planetary movement and celestial order with a precision later cultures struggled to match for long stretches of history. Their medical texts are not magical chants alone, but include procedures, formulas, diagnoses. The question becomes difficult to avoid if this knowledge developed gradually. Where is the long, visible trail of gradual development? Where is the fumbling stage, the extended trial, the obvious sequence of crude predecessors? The tablets answer in their own way. They say the knowledge was taught, given, remembered from before. The beings called Anunnaki descended established first cities, transferred structured knowledge, and in doing so, moved humans into civilization. This claim repeats too often to dismiss lightly. It appears not as a single oddity, but as a foundation stone in Mesopotamian self-understanding. They did not think they had invented everything from nothing. They thought they had inherited what had once belonged to others. Hilprecht, who spent years with the Nippur material, published carefully and conventionally. Yet in private notes preserved in the university archives, there are moments of hesitation, of pressure, of uncertainty about timelines that refuse to behave. Questions about why sophisticated concepts appear without visible precedent. Questions about why pre-flood civilization is spoken of not with casual poetic flourish, but with a strange seriousness. He did not publish those questions as conclusions. Academic life punishes conclusions that arrive before accepted permission. But the questions remained in his papers, and the fact that they remained matters. Because Nippur is still only partly excavated. Beneath the surface, more tablets remain, more archives remain, more darkness remains, and what has already emerged suggests not the rough dawn of civilization, but something closer to transplantation. A system moved intact, a blueprint implemented, a way of being human introduced all at once rather than painfully improvised over centuries. The Sumerians insisted they were not first. They described cities before the flood rulers, before remembered chronology beings who lived longer, knew more, and stood nearer to heaven than later men would. Those records sit now in museums under labels that say mythology. But mythology is not usually this careful with accounting, not usually this stubborn about procedure, not usually this unwilling to let the mechanism blur, which is why the next step is language itself. Because before the claims can be accepted or rejected, the script has to be opened. And when cuneiform was finally deciphered, the way it yielded to understanding revealed something about the text that still matters now. The reopening of cuneiform after 3 millennia of silence is one of archaeology's great intellectual recoveries. A language sealed in clay, a civilization mute until someone found the key. And what is often forgotten in the telling is the key worked because the script held precision, because it preserved measurable things, repeatable names, structured statements, practical records. Cuneiform was not deciphered by drifting through symbolism. It was deciphered because the script behaved consistently enough to be solved. The breakthrough came through the Behistun inscription carved high on a cliff in Persia under the order of Darius the Great. Henry Rawlinson risked his life copying it in the 19th century, suspended by ropes against stone, reproducing sign after sign in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Old Persian yielded first. Babylonian followed. And behind Babylonian scholars discovered something even older, another language beneath it, one the Babylonians themselves had translated, Sumerian. That discovery matters because Sumerian stands alone. It does not fit comfortably into a known family. It is not Semitic like Akkadian, not Indo-European like Greek or Persian, not Egyptian, not a branch we can trace backward to a larger linguistic tree. It appears isolated, agglutinative modular, built by stacking meaning onto meaning in a way that can feel almost procedural, almost coded, each element doing a job, each suffix altering function with unusual clarity. It is a language well suited to administration, to technical distinction, to preserving exact relations between things. Samuel Noah Kramer, perhaps the most influential Sumerologist of the 20th century, spent decades translating the tablets and bringing Sumerian literature into modern awareness. Through him and others, the world encountered hymns, law, laments, proverbs, debate, poems, creation texts, royal inscriptions. What emerged was not a primitive culture, speaking in vague sacred gestures. It was a culture capable of nuanced system and astonishing conceptual order. And as more texts were translated, certain anomalies began to press at the edges. Specialized vocabularies appear in Sumerian without obvious developmental trails. Terms for astronomical knowledge, metallurgical processes, administrative systems, medical procedures, architectural functions, technical clusters of language that look complete when they first become visible to us. In later cultures, this is often explained through borrowing. Languages absorb technical terms from older or more dominant knowledge traditions. But Sumerian is supposed to stand at the beginning of written civilization. If it is the source, where did its technical lexicons come from? The texts themselves offer an answer that scholarship usually relocates into theology. They say the knowledge was taught. Enki, lord of wisdom, keeper of the Abzu, possessed and distributed the principles that structure civilization. The me were not merely ideas. They could be carried, given, lost, taken. They behaved almost like packages of knowledge. Portable capability, stored order, civilization not as improvised behavior, but as transferable design. This same technical character becomes even harder to dismiss in the creation accounts. There the language tightens, repeats, fixes itself into recognizable sequence. The word for clay appears again and again. The word for blood or life substance accompanies it. The verb translated as create carries shades of mixing, combining, bringing components together. The result is not generic humanity in the loosest sense, but Lulu, the mixed one, the worker, the purpose-built being. And that constancy is the troubling thing. Creation myths usually evolve in the direction of local poetry. They soften into regional color. They accumulate difference. But the Sumerian creation vocabulary holds steady across Eridu-Genesis, across Atrahasis, across Enki and Ninmah, across later Babylonian recensions, different centuries, different scribes, different cities. Yet the same relation remains terrestrial material, divine essence, combination, successful outcome after difficulty, human as product. Take the verb often rendered simply as create. In English, create can imply bringing something into being from nothing, almost effortlessly. But the Sumerian root being translated carries heavier procedural weight. It can refer to mixing substances, compounding, brewing, shaping from gathered material. It suggests process rather than miracle, assembly rather than command, a thing made from components rather than summoned from absence. The same is true of blood. The creation texts do not merely mention life in a spiritual floating sense. They locate intelligence, reason, awareness in the blood of the sacrificed being, not in a poem's abstracted soul, but in a transferable material associated with consciousness itself. If a Bronze Age scribe needed to describe inherited cognitive potential without access to vocabulary for genes' chromosomes, encoded information, what would be available? Blood, essence, life substance, the carrier of lineage, the visible material through which traits appear to pass. Then there is clay. Modern readers instinctively soften clay into metaphor. Dust, earth, humble matter. But if the text is procedural, clay functions differently. It becomes raw, terrestrial substrate, base organic material, formless in the sense that it can be shaped and recombined. The earth source material already here, the available biological foundation. This is why some readers, however, reluctantly begin to hear the creation text not as religious poetry alone, but as documentation in ancient language of something like biological engineering. Not because the Sumerians understood molecular science. There is no need to claim that. But because their words may preserve witness or inherited memory of a process they themselves did not fully understand. If you saw something extraordinary but lacked the concepts to explain it, you would describe what you could observe. Materials taken, mixed, participants assigned, outcome produced, failures before success. That is exactly what these texts preserve. George Smith, one of the early great readers of Mesopotamian tablets, felt this tension. He noted that certain passages sounded less like liturgy than like prose of procedure. He ultimately folded that discomfort back into literary style, perhaps because the alternative was too unsettling to entertain seriously in his age. Yet the discomfort remains useful. It tells us the technical impression is not being invented now by modern projection alone. It has been there in the text waiting to be noticed. The tablets do not simplify. That is worth repeating, because myths often do. Myths reduce complexity into memorable form. They heighten symbol, sharpen archetype, compress process into image. But the Sumerian creation texts do something almost opposite. They enumerate, they specify, they preserve sequence. They leave in details that seem unnecessary if the goal is merely meaning, but necessary if the goal is fidelity. And all of this brings us to one of the most important surviving records of that sequence, a tablet in the British Museum, a fragment of Atrahasis, pale brown clay, careful columns a text preserved by the fire that destroyed the library that housed it. A destruction that became an act of accidental preservation. On that tablet, the process is described not as cosmic poetry, but with a startling closeness to manufacture, to labor replacement, to design, to mixture. And when we turn to it, the language grows more exact, not less. The Atrahasis tablets begin not with wonder, but with exhaustion. That is important. Human creation enters the Mesopotamian record, not first as a celebration, not first as a blessing, but as a solution to a problem. The lesser gods, the Agigi, have been laboring for long years, digging channels, cutting rivers, carrying out the hard work of reshaping the landscape. The burden grows too heavy. They rebel. They burn their tools. They march on the house of Enlil and demand release. This is a creation story with the structure of a labor dispute. A workers' strike at the cosmic level. The superior beings need the work done, but no longer wish to do it themselves. That premise alone already feels strangely practical, not abstract, not symbolic in the broad, floating sense. Practical. There is work. The workers refuse. A replacement must be designed. The gods gather in council. Enlil wants punishment. Anu measures the seriousness of the moment. Enki again becomes the figure of solution. What he proposes changes everything. Create another being, one capable of bearing the burden, one suited to the labor that the rebellious workers will no longer perform. The task then passes into the hands of the birth goddess, called by different names in different recensions. Nintu, Ninhursag, Mami, Belet, Ili, but always serving the same central role. Birth, formation, the management of life entering form. Then the procedure begins. A god is selected for sacrifice. In some versions, it is Geshtue. In others, another named being. But the crucial point remains the same. The one chosen possesses intelligence, consciousness, understanding. The text is explicit that this quality matters. His blood is not random fluid. It is the carrier of a specific trait. Something located in his substance must be transferred into the new creation. That insistence should not be blurred, because the text does not blur it. Intelligence in the blood, a transferable property in living matter. Then the clay is prepared, not just any clay, but clay connected to the earth, to the Abzu, to the deep source of terrestrial material. And then blood and clay are mixed. Thoroughly. This word thoroughly matters because the text makes it matter. Not superficially combined, not ceremonially touched, mixed at the level from which the new being will emerge, carrying both sources inseparably within itself. Divine element and earthly substrate joined in one material basis, and the process does not end there, because what follows is not immediate animation, not sudden adult appearance, not magical completion. The text moves into gestation. Birth clay is divided, positions are set, a birth chamber is prepared. Womb goddesses gather, time passes, months are counted. The 10th month arrives, the womb is opened, the beings are born. This is not incidental decoration. This is biological process, as the text understands it, development over time, guided by specialists, culminating in birth, rather than instantaneous manifestation. That sequence is difficult to overstate, because it changes the emotional texture of the entire narrative. We are not being shown God snapping fingers over mud. We are being shown something far slower, far more procedural, far more embodied. Material is gathered, combined, managed, developed, brought to term. The result is not an image, but a life form. If the purpose of the tale were only theological, if all that mattered was that humans owe labor to the gods, then so much of this sequence could have been omitted. The point could have been established much more simply. Yet the text lingers. It preserves the details of preparation, the divisions, the count of months, the assembly of those overseeing the birth, the specific concern that the resulting beings carry within them something enduring from the sacrifice source. Why preserve that unless the preservation of the process itself mattered? There is more. The creation is not perfect on the first attempt in all recensions. Other texts in the same orbit describe flawed beings, emerging beings unable to function properly, to reproduce, to work, to control their own bodies. In Enki and Ninmah, this becomes almost a contest, but beneath the literary surface lies the unmistakable pattern of trial and error. Attempt, flaw, adjustment. Another attempt, another failure. Technical criticism, revision. Then eventually a working result. Again, this is an odd thing for theology to preserve if the point is only divine omnipotence. Omnipotence does not need prototypes. Engineering does. And so the biological reading begins to draw strength from exactly the details that the symbolic reading tends to soften. Blood-carrying intelligence, earth source substrate, thorough mixture, managed gestation, failed iterations, final viable model. If a Bronze Age observer witnessed or inherited memory of a process involving alteration of an existing life form with material from another intelligent source, what language could possibly have captured it except this language that does not make the reading proven? It makes it difficult to dismiss without residue. The mainstream interpretation still stands with dignity. It says, these details are narrative elaboration. Mythic bureaucracy mirroring Mesopotamian society. Birth imagery reflecting the centrality of fertility and motherhood. Labor conflict projected upward to explain why humans toil below. All of that may be true at one level. But the question remains whether that is all that is true. Whether myth may also be carrying memory. Whether symbol may be wrapped around something stubbornly procedural, because what is being remembered was procedural. Atrahasis keeps returning to burden. Humans are created so that the gods may be relieved. That statement is repeated because the text wants it repeated. It is not enough to say humans exist. They exist for labor. Their origin is tied to function. They are a response to workload, a manufactured solution to a practical problem. Created not generally, but specifically. Not for mystery, but for use. The unsettling thing is how coherent that remains when read in biological terms. An advanced group encounters useful local life, but inadequate labor capacity. It modifies that life, gives it enough intelligence to understand instruction, enough resilience to work enough reproductive stability to sustain itself, but not so much freedom from death or dependency that it becomes uncontrollable. That is not modern science fiction inserted into the text. It is what the text begins to resemble when read literally, slowly, without the reflex that ancient words must always mean less than they say. The old clay fragment in the British Museum does not settle the matter. It deepens it. It deepens it because it is too careful, too procedural, too patient. It describes a making that sounds less like miracle and more like manufacture, less like spiritual allegory, and more like applied process. And if hypothesis gives us the mechanism, the next question is what it produced. Not generic man, not humanity in the abstract. Lulu, the mixed being, the primitive worker, the designation that may preserve more memory than any translation comfortably allows. Language remembers in ways civilizations do not always remember. A culture can forget its own foundations, while a single word goes on carrying the shape of an older idea. That is why Lulu matters so much. Because in English, the word usually disappears under man-human mankind. Broad, smooth, harmless. But in the Sumerian context, the term is narrower, heavier, and possibly far more revealing than those translations allow. The root lu can refer to man, person, servant, one who performs a role. When the form becomes Lulu, scholars debate precisely what the duplication does. Emphasis, perhaps. Intensification. But there are also arguments that, in Sumerian, such repetition can imply modification mixture, a thing brought into a more specific or altered state. The debate matters because the creation texts do not use this word casually. They use it where function, origin, and purpose converge. In hypothesis, the instruction is explicit. Let the womb goddess create the Lulu. Let him bear the yoke. Let him carry the toil of the gods. This is not a vague blessing over a species. It is an assignment of design intent. The being is made to carry burden, to take over labor, to relieve others. When that statement is repeated across texts, the repetition does not weaken it. It strengthens it. The script keeps pressing the same wedge into the clay. Worker, burden bearer, created for a task. There are places where the wording becomes even more suggestive. Phrases like Lulu Amelu appear literally something like Lulu Man, as if the text itself distinguishes between the created designation and the broader category of human. Why would such doubling be necessary if Lulu already meant mankind in a simple generic sense? The redundancy suggests that it may not be generic, that it may designate a class, a model, a produced being that later becomes what we call human. This would fit the larger narrative pattern. Before Lulu, the world of the text contains gods, lesser divine laborers, animals, cities before the flood, beings arranged in ranks. Then, at a specific point, a worker class is created. That created class is not eternal. It has a beginning. It is the answer to a problem. And the language surrounding it remains technical enough to sound almost like classification. Other Sumerian contexts push in the same direction. Dependent status, servile relation, being held in function rather than existing entirely for oneself. These ideas cluster around forms of the term. Not every appearance proves the same nuance, but the cumulative effect matters. The word does not float free of labor. It keeps returning to service, to burden, to a being whose existence is tied to someone else's purpose. And this is where the question becomes more difficult, because if Lulu names us not as naturally emerged humanity, but as modified worker being, then the creation accounts are saying something far sharper than a pious tale about purpose. They are saying humans were manufactured as a labor solution. That statement becomes even stranger when placed beside other recurring motifs in the tablets. failed attempts before success. Different kinds of beings preceding the final stable version. Long-lived rulers before the flood, then shorter-lived rulers after. Wisdom given immortality, withheld. Knowledge transferred, but not everything. Capability granted, but with limits. These are not random fragments. They align. They suggest design with parameters. Mainstream scholarship reads the labor language morally or socially. Why do humans suffer? Because gods made them to work. Why are social hierarchies old? Because heaven established hierarchy first. Why does burden define mortal life? Because burden belongs to the human condition. All of that is possible. But once again, the objection is not that this reading is absurd. The objection is that it does not fully explain why the texts preserve so much procedure if all they want is the moral frame. Why the blood? Why the clay? Why the mixture? Why the gestation? Why the flawed prototypes? Why the technical designation? Why the almost contractual tone with which the goddess can report back the task you gave me has been completed? Your burden has been placed on man. That last formulation matters. It sounds less like hymn than delivery notice. A problem was raised. A solution was engineered. The burden has been transferred. And if that still sounds too literal, too close to manufacture, then it is worth pausing over how widespread this pattern is beyond Sumer. The Popol Vuh preserves multiple failed attempts at creating humans before successful corn people emerge. Egyptian traditions describe humanity formed from clay on a potter's wheel for divine purposes. Greek mythology has Prometheus shaping humans from earth and then giving them an additional vital element. Genesis forms Adam from dust and then adds divine life. Hindu traditions speak in cycles of shaping purpose and divine intervention. The pattern is almost global, earthly material, plus higher source often after previous attempts, often with function attached. Either human cultures repeatedly invented the same strange sequence because some universal need made it irresistible, or they preserved some distant refracted memory of the same event using their own languages and symbols. The Sumerian version may matter most because it is early, because it is written, because it remains unusually procedural. If all the later versions are echoes, this may be nearer the original acoustics. And then there is the matter of lifespan, because alongside the worker designation runs another recurring discomfort, the possibility that the human being as produced was not static, that there were earlier and later models, that mortality itself may not be the pure natural given we assume it to be. These ideas appear most clearly in the king lists and in stories where wisdom is granted, while eternal life is deliberately denied. They suggest not merely creation, but calibration. If that is so, then Lulu is not just a name. It is a category, a model, a created state with chosen limits. Enough intelligence for labor, enough life for utility, enough selfhood to function, not enough freedom from death to exceed its design. This is where the script circles back to the same question, because the original texts circle back to it too. What are we reading? A metaphor for social order, or a memory of modification? Are these stories describing what mortals feel like, or what mortals are earthly, yet other? Bound to the ground, yet carrying something not entirely of the ground. Workers, yes, but workers mixed from more than one source. The clay tablets never hurry to answer. They let the question remain in the room, and once it remains there, the old king lists begin to look different as well. Because if humans were modified, if Lulu was an engineered designation, then the impossible rains before the flood stop, looking merely ridiculous. They begin to look like traces of another parameter entirely. In Oxford, in the Ashmolean Museum, there is a clay prism catalogued as WB444, more often called the Weld-Blundell prism. It stands only about 11 inches high, inscribed on all four sides, neat columns of cuneiform, wrapping the clay like compressed chronology. At first glance, it is merely one more ancient text. But the list it carries remains one of the most troublesome documents in early history. The text begins with a statement that is almost too simple for how much weight it carries when kingship was lowered from heaven. Kingship was in Eridu, not invented, lowered, not discovered, bestowed. The wording harmonizes immediately with everything else the tablets insist upon order, arriving from above civilization, transmitted, not generated from below by gradual experiment. Then the prism starts listing rulers and reign lengths, and the problem deepens sharply. The first king Alulim rules for 28,800 years. The next Alalgar for 36,000. The list continues through a sequence of antediluvian kings whose combined reigns extend to impossible totals. Then a line appears with devastating brevity the flood swept over. After that line, kingship is lowered from heaven again now to Kish. And after that, the lengths contract. They do not become fully ordinary at once, but they move steadily toward recognizably human scales. Decades, generations, reigns that belong, however imperfectly, inside history. This smooth transition is part of the difficulty. If the whole list were purely symbolic, it would be easier to dismiss. If the impossible numbers remained impossible throughout, they could sit comfortably inside mythic grandeur. But the document moves from impossible to plausible without signaling a sharp genre change. Later kings on the list overlap with rulers and cities attested elsewhere. Gilgamesh appears, once thought purely legendary, until archaeology confirmed a historical ruler behind the figure. Other names hover at the border, where myth and history refuse clean separation. So, what are the enormous early numbers doing there? The mainstream answer is familiar. Symbolic numerology, base 60 mathematics rendered into reign lengths, ritualized chronology, scribal exaggeration. Maybe the units are not years in the modern sense. Maybe the text encodes astronomical cycles. Maybe it preserves dynastic prestige rather than biological lifespan. All of these are possible. All are reasonable attempts to keep the document inside familiar interpretive boundaries. But the problem persists because the list was copied and recopied across cities and centuries with those enormous numbers intact. Scribes preserved them carefully. They did not smooth them away. They did not remove the absurdity. Why preserve absurdity so faithfully unless it was believed to preserve something important? The same pattern appears beyond Mesopotamia. Biblical patriarchs live for centuries before lifespans contract. Egyptian king traditions place gods and semi-divine rulers across vast spans before ordinary dynasties emerge. Vedic cycles recall ages when human life extended far beyond current norms. Baras's writing much later still preserves Mesopotamian traditions of enormous pre-flood reigns. Again, the convergence returns. Long ages before, short ages after, a catastrophe between. Memory of a break. If the creation texts are read biologically, the king list becomes newly uncomfortable in a different way. Perhaps early models were not the same as later ones. Perhaps the beings ruling before the flood were not humans in the modern sense, or not humans with modern biological limits. Perhaps long-lived variants existed, whether as original populations, modified classes, or hybrid lineages closer to those who designed them. Then after catastrophe or deliberate reset lifespan contracts. A new model, a more controlled one, less time to accumulate knowledge, less time to challenge inherited authority, less continuity across generations. This may sound speculative, and it is, but it is speculation generated from the structure of the texts themselves. They insist on before and after. They insist that something changed. They insist that what was lowered from heaven existed prior to current conditions. They insist with almost bureaucratic calm that the world after the flood was not the world before it. The flood in these records is not just a dramatic weather event. It is a boundary marker in ontology. Before it, kingship direct from heaven, enormous reigns closer divine-human relation. After it, reduced scales, altered conditions, survival, and restart. The line the flood swept over is brief, but what it divides is enormous. It divides time itself into two regimes. If so much was reset after the flood, the question becomes what exactly was restarted. This is where another Sumerian concept enters, one that may help explain why civilization appears fully formed at the beginning of the historical record. The me, often translated as divine decrees, powers, principles of civilization. But that translation is never quite enough, because the me behave less like abstract virtues than like transferable blueprints. They can be possessed, moved, stolen, distributed. A city can gain them. A god can lose them. They correspond not to one generalized blessing, but to discrete capabilities, kingship, priesthood, music, metalwork, scribal practice, judgment, craftsmanship, and more. In other words, civilization itself in packaged form. If that sounds modern, that is part of the unease. The me do not behave like vague, sacred favor. They behave like stored capability, information in a form the text can treat almost materially, knowledge as object, order as transferable possession. And if early civilization did not slowly develop, but was restored after catastrophe, then the ME begin to look less like poetic abstractions and more like archives, civilizational memory made portable, which would mean the Sumerians were saying something even stranger than that gods once ruled before the flood. They were saying that after catastrophe, structured knowledge survived in transmissible form and was given back to humanity. Given back. That phrase matters because it returns us to the same loop again. Not invented, but given. Not discovered, but lowered. Not grown from below, but brought from above. The repetition is not accidental. The Sumerian record circles the same idea from different angles until it becomes difficult to pretend the insistence means nothing. And so, from the impossible reins of the prism, we move naturally to the me themselves. The blueprints of civilization, the strange packages of ordered knowledge that may explain why the first cities in human history seem already to know how to be cities. Among the most curious words in Sumerian literature is me. It is usually translated in ways that gesture toward meaning without fully enclosing it, divine powers, decrees, ordinances, principles of civilization. Yet each of those translations feels incomplete. The problem is not that the word is vague. The problem is that it appears too precise for our categories. The Ami are treated as if they are both abstract and tangible, both principles and possessions, both invisible structures and things that can be moved from one place to another. This is nowhere clearer than in the myth of Inanna and Enki. In the narrative, Enki, Lord of Wisdom, keeps the Mi in Eridu, the primordial city, the first center. Inanna visits him. There is feasting. There is drink. In his intoxication, Enki begins handing the Mi over to her. Not one or two general blessings, but an extensive list: kingship, priesthood, music, metalwork, scribeship, crafts, wisdom, law, judgment, decision-making, sexual rights, warfare, lamentation, and many more. Over 100 distinct civilizational capacities are enumerated. The list is so specific that it becomes difficult to hear it as loose poetry. These are not broad cosmic abstractions. They are discrete domains of organized life. Then Inanna departs with them in her boat. Enki sobers, realizes what has happened, sends forces after her to retrieve them. She reaches Uruk. The Emi are installed there. Civilization changes location, or rather, capability changes location. A city becomes what it can become because it now possesses what another city once possessed centrally. If the Emi are only symbolic virtues, the whole story becomes oddly overbuilt. Why should a god drunkenly give away abstractions, then urgently try to take them back? Why must they be transported? Why does their location matter? Why does one city gain stature by acquiring them from another? But if the Emi are understood as concentrated knowledge, systems, transferable packets of method law craft, governance, and technical understanding, the story suddenly becomes coherent. It reads almost like the relocation of a civilizational archive. This is what makes the Mi so important to the larger question. They may explain why Sumerian civilization appears in the archaeological record with astonishing maturity. If a developed body of knowledge already existed and was then transferred, distributed, installed, the absence of a long, visible trial phase becomes less surprising. The first cities would not be inventing civilization from scratch. They would be implementing it. That is, of course, a radical way to hear the text. Scholarship prefers to hear the Mi as theological constructs, the powers that make civilized order possible, because divine authority underwrites them. That reading has real strength. It fits how myth often personifies institutions. But again, the details resist reduction. The Mi are counted, listed, moved, fought over. A city without them is not simply less blessed, but less capable. A city with them gains operational range. Think of how the Mi align with what the Sumerians claimed elsewhere: kingship lowered from heaven, civilization given knowledge remembered from before. The entire culture keeps returning to the same pattern. Ordered capacities descend. They are possessed and distributed. Humans receive them. Cities become functional through them. The loop closes again and again. If an advanced population needed to elevate a terrestrial worker, species rapidly into organized civilizational life, what would be required? Not scattered inspiration, not vague spiritual uplift, structured knowledge, agriculture, measurement, writing, law, administration, metallurgy, ritual order, social hierarchy, architecture, medical practice, astronomy, packages of applied capability. In the mythic language available to the Sumerians, the Mi serve exactly this role. That may sound like software described by people who had never seen software, or archives described by people who had no word for archive in the modern technical sense. Transferable units containing operational competence, stored order that can be relocated, civilizational blueprints. And once that possibility is allowed into view, Sumerian development looks different. Their mathematical system does not need a long visible birth because it may have been received as a system. Their urban administration does not need to visibly evolve from village improvisation because procedures may already have existed. Their astronomy does not begin with crude stargazing and slowly become exact because exact observation may have arrived with the package later maintained and extended by scribes. This would also explain the Sumerian insistence that civilization is older than they are, that it existed before the flood, that first cities stood before remembered history, that what later humans rebuilt was not unprecedented innovation, but restoration. Restoration from a backup. Civilization as recoverable because it had been archived. There is something haunting about that idea. The flood destroys, time breaks, lifespans shorten, conditions change. But the me remains somewhere, preserved, retransferable. Enough survives that order can descend again. Kingship can be lowered again. Cities can become cities again. Not because humanity slowly rediscovers everything, but because the patterns were never wholly lost. This is why the me matter not only for civilization, but for the human story itself. If the same beings who created Lulu also possessed and distributed the me, then humanity was not merely modified biologically. It was modified culturally, engineered first as worker, then equipped as inheritor. Created for labor, yes, but eventually entrusted with ordered knowledge sufficient to continue without constant oversight. That possibility changes the emotional shape of the story. Humans are not only burden bearers, they are recipients, not only designed, but instructed, not only made, but furnished with a partial inheritance, enough to build cities, enough to govern, enough to remember fragments of where all this came from, even if the remembering eventually hardened into myth. And yet some inheritances are incomplete by design. The texts keep hinting at that too. Wisdom can be granted while immortality is withheld. Knowledge can be given in packages while one central limit remains untouched. Humans may receive civilization, but not everything. They may be made capable, but not unbounded. The line between gift and restriction remains sharp. That line comes into view most clearly in the story of Adapa, the wise man of Eridu, perfected in understanding, yet denied eternal life. A figure whose narrative may preserve something crucial about how the created worker was meant to remain limited, even while becoming intelligent. Adapa is one of the most revealing figures in Mesopotamian literature because his story turns on a limit, not a limit of understanding because he is granted extraordinary understanding, not a limit of favor because he stands close to Enki, not a limit of access because he is brought even into the presence of heaven. The limit is something else. Life itself, duration, the one thing he does not receive. The text describes him as a sage of Eridu, wise beyond ordinary men, formed or ordered by Enki with vast intelligence. He understands the designs of the land. He is not a fool wandering into cosmic affairs accidentally. He is close to the center. And then the story places him in an episode that on the surface feels almost small. He is fishing in the Persian Gulf. the south wind overturns his boat. In anger, he breaks the south wind's wing. The disturbance reaches heaven. Anu notices. Adapa is summoned upward to answer. Before he ascends, Enki instructs him carefully. He tells Adapa what to wear, how to behave, what to say, and most importantly, what not to accept. Food and water will be offered. Enki warns, but these are the food and water of death. Do not eat, do not drink. Adapa obeys. He rises. He appears before Anu. He impresses the heavenly court. And then comes the reversal. Anu offers him not death, but life. The moment is as simple as it is devastating. Adapa, designed with wisdom, but not immortality, is brought to the edge of crossing that design boundary. The gift is genuine. The potential is real. But because he trusts the one who formed him, he refuses. He declines the food and water of life. And in declining, he seals the human condition. Intelligence without eternity, understanding without unending continuity. What matters here is not only the pathos of the scene, it is the structure of it. The text itself says wisdom was given to Adapa, but eternal life was not. Not could not be. Not failed to be. Was not. The withholding is deliberate, a chosen specification, a built-in limit. That is already an extraordinary thing for a myth to preserve so clearly. Humans are not naturally mortal in the abstract sense of cosmic necessity. They are beings from whom immortality has been specifically withheld. Then the tale intensifies the point by showing that the limit could, under certain conditions, have been crossed. The possibility exists. Anu offers it. Enki blocks it through deception. In other words, the system can be altered, but alteration is not permitted. This is where the biological reading becomes difficult to ignore again. If humans are designed organisms, then lifespan is a parameter. It can be longer, it can be shorter, it can perhaps be modified by those who know how. Adapa's story preserves exactly that, a being engineered with exceptional cognitive capacity, yet kept mortal by intentional design and by active prevention when the chance for change appears. Read that way, the story harmonizes disturbingly well with the king list. Long durations before, reduced durations after. Mortality not as timeless essence, but as chosen limitation. A worker species intelligent enough to function, not immortal enough to accumulate dangerous continuity. Each generation ends. Knowledge must be re-earned. Power cannot gather without interruption forever. The design remains safe. Again, mainstream scholarship offers a more familiar interpretation. Adapa is wisdom literature, a reflection on the tragic human condition. Humans may approach divine understanding, but cannot cross the boundary into divine life. It is a story about accepting mortality and respecting cosmic order. That reading is elegant and old, and it should not be discarded lightly. But even within that frame, the mechanics are striking. Why such emphasis on deliberate withholding? Why dramatize the possibility of immortality at all, unless the tradition wished to preserve the memory that this boundary was not inevitable, only enforced? The story's emotional power comes from that very tension. Humans are close enough to the divine to be offered life, yet kept from taking it. The possibility is shown only to be withdrawn. That is not the shape of a story that says mortality is obvious. It is the shape of a story that says mortality is a deprivation. And perhaps that is why it continues to resonate so deeply. Because humans do not relate to death the way animals appear to. We question it, rage against it, mythologize against it, build religions against it, search for medicine against it. We do not merely endure mortality. We dispute it. We behave as though something in us suspects that this condition is not what it should have been. The Adapa text can be heard as preserving that suspicion. You could have lived. The potential was there. It was denied. If the creators of Lulu designed their worker being carefully, then intelligence and mortality would need to be balanced. Too little intelligence, and the workers cannot perform complex tasks. Too much unbroken continuity, and they become harder to control. A mortal, intelligent species solves both problems at once, capable, but resettable. That is a chilling thought, and perhaps for that reason the text wraps it in story. But wrapping is not erasure. Beneath the narrative remains a design logic that is difficult to miss once seen. Wisdom granted, eternal life withheld. Not because it could not be given, but because it was not meant to be given. And still the stories do not stop there. They continue downward into places where death itself becomes process, where divine beings pass through structured stages of stripping termination and return. The descent myths, especially Inanas, may preserve another kind of memory entirely. Not of creation, not of mortality imposed, but of what lay below those limits. Of what happened when consciousness itself crossed a threshold and came back changed. Inanna's descent is one of the most haunting narratives in the ancient world because it feels older than explanation. It carries the weight of ritual, the geometry of symbol, and something else, something almost procedural beneath the beauty. The story is familiar in outline. Inanna, Queen of Heaven, chooses to descend to the underworld ruled by her sister, Ereshkigal. Why she goes is never explained in a way that fully settles the question. She simply descends. The choice itself feels like an initiation. Before she goes, she prepares. That preparation matters. She instructs her attendant what to do if she does not return, whom to approach, in what order, what pleas to make. This is not casual, it is contingency planning, a protocol established before entering a dangerous system. Already the myth sounds less spontaneous than structured. Then come the 7 gates. At each one, something is removed. Crown, jewelry, breastplate, robe, ring, measuring rod, royal garment. With each gate, a layer of identity falls away. With each gate, Inanna becomes less adorned, less armed, less socially and cosmically defined. By the time she reaches the throne room below, she has been reduced to essence. Then judgment falls. She is struck dead. Her corpse is hung on a hook. The standard interpretation is agricultural and seasonal. Fertility descends into the earth, disappears, returns. Vegetation dies and rises again. This interpretation is powerful and ancient, and the text undeniably participates in that symbolic field. But the 7 stages, the forced stripping, the protocols, the exactness of movement through thresholds, these features also suggest process. Sequential deconstruction, identity disassembly before reconstitution. Enki intervenes, and eventually Inanna is revived. But her return is not free. A substitute must be provided. someone must take her place. Dumuzi is chosen, then a cycle is established in which part of the year belongs below and part above. Death and return become regulated exchange. The details again feel less like dream than system. 7 stages, specific losses at each stage. Death, suspension, retrieval, substitution, re-emergence. If one were trying an ancient language to preserve memory of consciousness, transfer identity stripping, or some form of controlled passage through death-like states, what would that preservation look like? Perhaps very much like this. Not because the Sumerians had scientific concepts for neural continuity or biological reactivation, but because they understood thresholds, protocols, and the danger of passing them improperly. If the Anunnaki possessed technologies far beyond human comprehension, then procedures concerning death preservation or return might easily have entered memory as descent myths. Gods passing below, being dismantled, restored, returning, altered. The poetry would be unavoidable because the experience would be overwhelming. But the sequence could still preserve operational truth. This possibility matters because it complements Adapa. Their immortality is withheld from humanity. Here, divine beings seem to possess access to processes that move through death and return beyond it. The asymmetry is striking. Those above can cross certain boundaries. Humans below cannot. The line remains. And then another kind of preservation enters the picture entirely, not descent into death, but preparation for catastrophe. The Instructions of Shurupak, a wisdom text among the oldest known, framed as advice from father to son, from king to survivor, from before the flood to after. The content is practical, almost to the point of understatement. Advice about fields, conduct, boundaries, speech, labor, fairness. Yet, its very existence raises a question. Why preserve pre-flood instruction at all unless the distinction between before and after mattered? If the flood is only literary frame, then the text can remain simple wisdom. But if the flood marks actual rupture, then Shurupak becomes something else preserved. Civilizational memory meant to survive catastrophe. Not cosmic secrets, but the things one needs to rebuild. Agriculture, order, restraint, social cohesion. Practical knowledge that keeps a community alive after everything else has been swept away. The instructions read like backup. Portable culture, distilled rules for making continuity possible when continuity has been broken. That too aligns with everything else. Civilization as transmitted, knowledge as given and preserved, archives as necessary because disaster comes, scribes copying texts not just to remember stories, but to ensure restoration after collapse. If the flood taught Mesopotamia anything, it may have been that civilization must be stored redundantly because it can be lost quickly. Nippur's libraries, Uruk's tablets copied lists and repeated formulas. All of this begins to resemble not only tradition, but backup protocol. And once again, the same loop returns. Humanity created. Humanity given structured knowledge. Humanity kept mortal. Humanity surviving catastrophe by preserving fragments of what came before. The circle closes and opens at once. Of course, none of this proves the most radical reading. It does not prove genetic engineering. It does not prove visitors from elsewhere. It does not prove ancient technologies beyond recovery. What it proves is smaller and in some ways more unsettling. That the texts consistently behave as though they are preserving process. Whether the process is symbolic, historical, or some difficult fusion of both is the question we are left with. Which is why mainstream interpretation deserves to be faced directly and not caricatured. The scholarly reading is coherent. It exists for reasons. But like many coherent systems, it may also reveal its limits at exactly the points where the old tablets become too specific to remain comfortable. The academic interpretation of these texts is not careless. It is not lazy. It is not simply blind refusal. It rests on a structure built over generations of disciplined work. The Sumerian creation accounts from that perspective, are mythological narratives shaped by theological and social needs. They explain human burden by projecting it into divine precedent. They explain social hierarchy by placing hierarchy in heaven first. They explain the mystery of origins with the symbolic tools available to Bronze Age minds. On this reading, the gods are not historical actors, but sacred figures through whom Mesopotamian society thought about itself. There is real strength in that approach. Comparative mythology shows similar patterns across cultures. Humans everywhere imagine divine makers. They imagine earth shaped into flesh. They imagine heavenly powers breathing purpose into matter. Genesis, Egyptian theology, Greek myth, Mayan accounts, Hindu cycles all repeat forms of the same urge. It would be rash to ignore that universality. A symbolic reading does not emerge from nowhere. It explains why creation stories matter to people. It explains why societies preserve them. It explains why divine action becomes the language of meaning. Mainstream scholarship also points reasonably to internal variation. Atrahasis is not enuma elish. Eridu Genesis is not exactly Enki Enigma. Different texts frame creation differently, emphasize different divine actors, and serve different literary purposes. This is typical of mythic traditions. Stories vary. They adapt. They absorb local theology. Therefore, scholars say these texts should not be read as synchronized historical testimony. They are literature, ritual, thought, narrative theology. All of that must be acknowledged. It is the serious case. But acknowledgement is not the same as surrendering every contrary observation, because even within that framework, problems remain. The first is procedural density. Myths generally do not need to process this carefully. They need memorable images, emotionally resonant structures, symbolic logic. Yet the creation texts repeatedly preserve materials, sequence, gestation, flawed iterations, and technical vocabulary. The social message could survive without these details. The theology could survive without these details. Why then do the details persist? The second problem is the technical texture of Sumerian civilization itself. This is a culture whose astronomical, mathematical, administrative, and legal records often display extraordinary precision. If one class of texts from that world can preserve accurate procedure and observation, why assume another class must automatically be symbolic only? The fact that a text is sacred does not make it false, nor does the fact that ancient people used divine language mean no real memory lies beneath that language. The third difficulty is the Sumerian insistence that civilization was inherited rather than invented. Mainstream interpretation usually treats this as religious humility or political legitimization, but the claim appears too broadly and too consistently to feel merely ornamental. The Sumerians seem genuinely to have believed that writing law kingship, the arts of organized life, came from elsewhere, from beings before them, from heaven, in whatever sense that phrase meant to them. Explaining why that belief existed and persisted so strongly remains harder than simply labeling it myth. Then there is the question of convergence. If creation stories across cultures all preserve Earth plus divine essence motifs because of universal cognitive tendencies, why do so many also preserve the same, more specific shapes? Failed attempts before successful humans, mortality imposed or withheld labor or service as human function, catastrophic flood, dividing epics, long-lived beings before shortened human life. These are not merely broad parallels. Some are uncannily detailed. Mainstream scholarship answers that human minds produce recurring archetypes under similar existential pressures. That is possible, perhaps even likely to some extent. But recurring archetype is not the only explanation for converging memory. If a real event lay deep in the past, altered, retold, ritualized, mythologized, then convergence would also be expected. This is where the limits of interpretation become visible. Modern scholarship works within a naturalistic framework that rightly excludes supernatural certainty. But that same framework can create a blind spot. Ancient reports of non-human or more than human intervention are often sorted only into one of two boxes: false myth or impossible theology. The possibility that such reports could preserve memory of intervention by advanced but natural beings, whether earlier civilizations, visitors, or something else not properly divine in the theological sense, rarely receives serious room. And yet that third category may be precisely the one these texts keep straining toward. A Bronze Age scribe witnessing advanced engineering would not call it engineering. He would call it divine work. A culture receiving complex knowledge from beings far superior in capability would not call them a technologically advanced population. It would call them gods. If that is the case, then reading ancient texts through strict modern distinctions between myth and science may itself distort the record. The texts may be mythologized descriptions of events that were at root natural occurrences beyond the conceptual range of those first preserving them. That does not mean every divine story hides a machine. It does mean the possibility cannot be dismissed solely because the ancient vocabulary is religious, and so the tension remains. The scholarly model explains much. It explains symbolism. It explains cultural function. It explains why these stories mattered. But it does not always explain why they sound at crucial points, like documentation. It does not fully explain the procedural fixation. It does not fully explain the transmission of technical detail across long spans. It does not fully explain why the Sumerians themselves spoke as inheritors rather than originators. Once again, the loop closes. Perhaps they were wrong. Or perhaps we are wrong about them being wrong. That is the question the tablets keep pressing forward without resolving. To move further, we have to strip away all inherited categories for a moment and ask a narrower question. What do the texts describe if we attend only to the procedure, not to the theology, not to the labels, only to the steps? When that is done, what emerges is difficult to ignore. It emerges as a biological reading. If the creation accounts are read only for their procedural content, a remarkably coherent sequence appears. Biological material associated with intelligence is obtained from one source. Terrestrial material is obtained from another. The two are thoroughly mixed. The result is managed through gestation. The first outputs are not all successful. Adjustment is required. Eventually, a stable, functional, reproductive model emerges. That model is designated for labor, trained and incorporated into the world of work. Stripped to that level, the texts do not read like poetry. They read like process. Blood in the ancient language becomes the nearest available term for hereditary essence. Clay becomes the nearest available term for earthly biological substrate. Mixing becomes the nearest available term for recombination. Gestation remains gestation. Failed attempts remain failed attempts. The final worker being remains the final worker being. Nothing needs to be added. Only the old words need to be heard with their procedural force intact. This reading also has explanatory power beyond the tablets themselves. It helps account for why humans appear so strange relative to surrounding life. In the source material, modern humans are imagined as a sudden arrival, not a slow natural flowering. They are fitted for labor and abstract thought all at once. They possess unusual cognitive range. They ask questions that seem excessive for simple survival. They do not sit easily inside the ecosystem in the way other species seem to. They alter the environment compulsively, as if they are not fully adjusted to it. They look at the stars and feel an ache out of proportion to practical need. Perhaps, as the text suggests, they are of the earth and not entirely of it. The source script pushes this argument into modern genetic language without claiming full proof. Human chromosome structure appears unusual in specific ways. Human cognitive capacity seems disproportionate to bare environmental requirements. The species arrives suddenly in behavioral terms. Technology accelerates rapidly once civilization begins. All of these features in the radical reading look less like smooth gradualism and more like modification recent enough to preserve imperfections, successful enough to dominate the planet. Again, none of this is certain. But uncertainty is not the same thing as incoherence. The biological reading has coherence. It explains why the texts preserve what they preserve. It explains why the human being in those texts is not generic, but designated. It explains why immortality is withheld. It explains why long-lived rulers precede shorter-lived humanity. It explains why civilization can appear already formed because knowledge is transferred to a species that was itself already designed. Most importantly, it explains why so many independent tablets maintain the same pattern. Atrahasis from Babylon, Enki and Ninmah from Nippur, Eridu Genesis fragments, old Sumerian traditions beneath later Akkadian recensions. Across centuries, cities, and changing political worlds, the creation mechanism remains stable. The participants may be named differently, the frame may shift, but the process does not drift very far. Blood or essence from above, clay from below, mixture, birth, worker, again and again. That kind of convergence usually suggests common source. The scribes do not treat the procedure as flexible literary material. They treat it as something to be preserved. They can ornament around it. They can frame it differently, but the core remains fixed. And then there is the hierarchy. Anunnaki above, Igigi beneath them, Lulu beneath that, animals below. This is not a vague cosmos of floating beings. It is structured taxonomy, orders of existence with clear relationships, original population, laboring subordinate population, modified replacement population, terrestrial life beneath all of them. Once seen this way, the entire system reads less like theology and more like categorized memory of different classes of being. The flood then becomes the great boundary within that system. Before it, stronger proximity between classes, longer durations, more direct intervention. After it, shortening lifespans, greater distance, partial inheritance, eventual divine withdrawal. The Anunnaki depart or recede. Humans continue with the me, with archives, with partial instruction, carrying forward a civilization that was never entirely their own invention. If humans are modified rather than wholly native in the natural sense, much else changes too. History becomes the story of a designed species trying to understand itself without full access to its design. Religion becomes fragmented memory of creators. Myth becomes corrupted documentation. Civilization becomes the unfolding of inherited capacities rather than the spontaneous emergence of a species from animal simplicity into reflective modernity. The emotional consequence of that possibility is profound. It means humans are neither random accident nor fully self-originating triumph. They are deliberate beings who no longer fully know the purpose for which they were made. They carry capacities they did not choose, limits they did not choose, questions they cannot stop asking. They are workers who became thinkers, instruments who became self-aware. And perhaps that is why the old texts remain so powerful. Because whether one accepts the biological reading or not, the human condition inside them feels recognizably our own. We are burdened, intelligent, mortal, restless, drawn upward, drawn backward, unable to feel wholly at home in earth or heaven. Suspicious somewhere deep within that our story may be stranger than the stories we officially tell. That is why the tablets endure as more than artifacts. They are pressure points. They press against every settled account of what a human being is. They do not offer comfort. They offer an opening, perhaps narrow, perhaps dangerous, but real. And from that opening, the final question rises not only what the tablets mean, but what it would mean for us if even part of their oldest memory were true. Evening falls across museum galleries with a peculiar softness. The last visitors leave. Reflections deepen in the glass. Air systems hum with indifferent precision. Clay tablets remain where they have remained all day, and where they will remain all night, under temperatures and humidities carefully chosen to preserve what fire and ruin once preserved by accident. In Philadelphia, CBS 1673 waits. In Oxford, WB 444 waits. In London, fragments of atrahasis and descent narratives wait. They do not change according to the categories placed upon them. They do not hurry to defend themselves. They simply continue to remember. And what they remember or seem to remember is difficult to live with comfortably. Blood and clay thoroughly mixed. A worker fashioned to bear another's burden. Wisdom granted. Immortality withheld. Civilization lowered from heaven. Blueprints of ordered life transferred from one city to another, from one class of beings to another. Long-lived rulers before catastrophe. Shorter-lived humanity after it. Flood as reset. Archives as survival. Myth as memory, or memory as myth. The same elements keep returning, each text circling the question from a slightly different angle, never far from the same center. What are we according to these records? If the mainstream reading is sufficient, then we are what modern scholarship says. We are a naturally evolved species that developed symbolic thought, told stories to explain its place in the cosmos, projected labor and hierarchy onto heaven, and preserved those stories with unusual richness because Mesopotamian culture valued writing sequence and order. On that reading, the tablets are magnificent, but not literal. They tell us who the Sumerians were, not who we are in any biological or historical sense. They are mirrors of ancient consciousness, not archives of species-level fact. But if the alternative reading is even partly right, then the implications deepen almost beyond measure. We are not merely children of gradual earthly development. We are modified beings, a terrestrial foundation altered by an external template. A worker species engineered for practical purpose, later entrusted with structured knowledge, then left to inherit a world we did not originally design. Our mortality may be chosen limitation. Our intelligence, a calibrated gift. Our civilization, not entirely self-generated, but seeded. That possibility does not reduce human worth. If anything, it intensifies it. A designed being can still become free. A created worker can still become a questioner, a builder, a moral agent. Indeed, that may be the deepest drama of the tablets, not that humans were made for burden, but that the burden bearer became capable of asking what burden means, where it came from, and whether it must continue. If we are evolved organisms, our meaning is something we construct under natural constraints. If we are designed organisms, our meaning becomes more complicated. We may need to ask whether original design defines destiny, or whether self-awareness breaks design open and creates a new freedom. Were we made only to work? Or were we made with the possibility that one day we would understand what had been done to us and decide for ourselves what to become? The old texts do not answer that. They leave us standing in uncertainty. But perhaps that is their power. They do not force belief. They preserve possibility. And possibility matters. Because the human story is shaped not only by what can be proven, but by what can still be asked. The tablets ask whether the oldest records of civilization may contain memories we have learned to dismiss because the implications are too large. They ask whether divine language may once have been the only available language for advanced intervention. They ask whether mythology can become the final mask worn by historical memory when the original context has been forgotten. Perhaps the Sumerians were wrong. Perhaps they looked at their own condition, their burden, their mortality, and built stories as all human cultures do. That remains possible. But another possibility remains also that they knew something closer to the truth than we have allowed, and that what sounds like impossible imagination to us sounded like remembered procedure to them. What if they were not inventing, but preserving? That question matters because human beings still feel divided in ways the natural story does not fully soothe. We feel of this world, and yet not fully of it. We feel bound to the earth, and yet pulled toward the stars. We build systems, then dismantle them. We inherit knowledge we did not create. We search for origins, as if origins might explain obligation. We search for our purpose, as if purpose may have been assigned before we became capable of refusing it. We dream of returning somewhere we cannot name. We dream of exceeding mortality. We dream of recovering a lost instruction. And in the quiet of a darkened gallery, the clay remembers that we have been asking these things for a very long time. The wedge-shaped marks pressed into those tablets 4,000 years ago do not tell us what to believe. They are more patient than belief. They offer a narrower, stranger gift, the chance to look again, to look without rushing to comfort, to look without automatically reducing every ancient technical phrase to metaphor or every ancient report of heaven to fantasy. To look and to admit that some texts remain difficult, not because they are obscure, but because they are too clear in ways we do not know how to accept. Perhaps that is why the question does not go away. Are we Earth's children in the straightforward natural sense, or are we Lulu, the mixed ones, the worker beings, the species shaped from clay, and something else? Are the tablets preserving beautiful inventions or patient fragments of documentation from a time before our time? Are the gods of Sumer gods, in the theological sense, or names given to beings whose capabilities exceeded the categories available to those who first watched them work? The clay does not answer. The clay only remembers. And so the question remains where the tablets leave it open, waiting unresolved, alive. Waiting in Philadelphia, waiting in Oxford, waiting in London, waiting in every translation read late at night by someone who cannot quite dismiss what the words appear to say. Maybe the oldest records in human history are only stories, or maybe they are the oldest memory we have of what was done to us. The tablets wait. The night deepens. Sleep comes slowly. Dreams arrive, and in those dreams, perhaps the oldest question returns once more in another form, as it has always returned, patient and circular and unfinished. What if they knew? What if they remembered? And what if the beings they called Lulu are us?